Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Shakshi Param Brahma, Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha. Akanda Mandala Karam Vyaktam Yena Characharam, Tatpadang Darshitang Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha. Agyana Timirandasya, Gyana Jana Shalakaya, Chakshurun Militang Yena, Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha. Om Shantihi, Shantihi, Shantihi. Indivisible, though consisting of infinite parts, transcendent, yet pervading everything. You are the auspicious primal cause of the universe, revealing its animate and inanimate objects. Reverent salutations unto thee. Manifesting as the mother of all knowledge, secular and spiritual, you dispel the illusion of ignorance and grant the precious boon of subtle insight. Your powerful presence has opened my inner eye of wisdom. Reverent salutations to the ultimate Guru. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat. We are coming to you on Easter. The first class last Sunday was on Ram Navami, so we have very auspicious days to begin this 5-class week or month of Sundays, we're calling it, on the teachings that Lord Vasishtha delivered to Sri Ram, the young avatar, unveiled as of yet at 14 years old, and also later the teachings that Ramachandra, when he was mature and grown, transmitted to his wife Sita and to Lakshmana and to Hanuman and to other fortunate souls who were alive in that yuga. And so we are very fortunate to be able to start last Sunday on this series of classes and to continue on Easter today about these great teachings of the Dharma. So we will plunge into those teachings where we left off, because I gave quite an introduction last week and satisfied the scene of King Dasaratha's court, where the young Ram, now in a kind of peak of divine depression, came before his father and in the court of King Dasaratha and read out this discourse of divine discontent. That's where we set the scene for that, and we're able to begin to glean wisdom from the young avatar's great mind as evinced by this presence of Maya all around that he had become observant of when he went out on pilgrimage and left the court of King Dasaratha, just like Buddha did some thousands of years later, leaving the court of his kingly father, the Sakya clan. So very, very much similar in Indian history, called the Itihasa, the various scriptural history that we have going back through India, even though it was difficult to access it until more recent times, when Swami Vivekananda came back and brought all of these great teachings out of the Jnana Shastras and the Dharma Shastras and the various teachings like Lord Vasishtha is giving us in Yoga Vasishtha. Those are all very ancient texts, but they span many centuries. And we wonder, we look in amazement at them because they hold these precious tenets and principles of renunciation and detachment and going beyond the heaven-aspiring senses and seeking liberation in this life. Liberation from what? From name and form, time and space. First by seeing that all of these exist in the mind, first of all, and then observing them there, gaining some witness consciousness around them. And witness consciousness is one of the things he'll talk about as we proceed down this list. In this chart we've been using about Sri Ram's discourse of divine discontent. You can see it there, although it's covered by this chart stand. Sri Ramachandra's divine discourse of divine discontent. So he comes as a young man in front of this very multivaried court of priests and royalty and courtiers and merchants and ordinary people. They all fill the king's court every sundown, and then they speak about dharmic principles, at least back in that age, and think about God at the end of their day, and probably get up in the morning with all of these teachings on their mind, which is a very wonderful thing, because that's what nowadays we're calling a discipline, where we have to meditate in the morning to see how our dream state was, and then at night meditate then to dissolve everything that happened to us during the day, and to neutralize it, you might say, too, like bubbles rising and forming and dissolving. These events that happen to us can affect our lives and do affect our lives over many lifetimes. In the Kala Chakra, in this cycle of ignorance-bound beings. And this is precisely what Sri Rama is trying to call attention to when he speaks about Maya and Ajnana. And we noted last week that he starts out with this diatribe, as they're using nowadays, about false superimposition, that is called by various names, like Vivarta or Adhyasa or Astitva. We looked at one chart already last week and almost finished it, that had something to do with this, maybe something that might be odd to beings who haven't looked as deeply as these great souls have into the appearance of things and seen beyond them. And they're still taking the world to be not only real, actual, but to be the only reality. And this has always been called Ajnana, or ignorance in India. Mula Vidya is another word for it. Root ignorance, that you're not even aware that everything around you that has taken on a solid form is throwing an appearance at you. That, as I said last week, and at Satsang Saturday, everything was stamped with that seal that's crying out, I'm not what I seem to be, and I cannot fulfill you, and don't cling to me. Take me as a matter of course and move beyond me. All of these things, objects in nature, seem to be crying out. Or as Sri Ramakrishna once put it, everyone comes here to the physical world and takes on a body, and then they become very enamored of the garden, but they forget about the gardener. So this is a little bit different direction than we were raised in, say in fundamentalist Christianity, with the story of Adam and Eve. There was a garden there, and the whole accent was upon sin and damnation thereafter. And in India it's more like, oh, this garden is a false appearance, but where's the gardener behind it? So immediately the seeker is not thinking in terms of limitation or sin or a black mark on the soul. They're thinking in terms of, here I am, I'm faced off with all of these appearances, and how do I see through them? Because I have a suspicion that the wool's been pulled over my eyes when I came into a physical body, took on 5 senses, and saw the 5 elements dancing before me in various permutations, like called wood or stone or flesh and bone. And then all of a sudden, when I experienced the objects of the senses, they began to taste like very sweet in the beginning, but turned very bitter later on, as Krishna says in the Gita. What you don't want is that which is sweet in the beginning that will turn bitter later. But what you should be looking for is that which is bitter in the beginning, that'll turn to nectar later, if you can see it and utilize it, face off against it, as the father of yoga has told us to do. Be very bold, as Vivekananda has told us to be, and see through these appearances like a yogi or a yogini would, or a sannyasin does. A realized soul, a illumined soul, or what we've been speaking about lately, and Ram will also mention it in his discourse here, a jivan mukta, a living liberated soul. You might say these classes of beings are given names, but when you come down to a word like jivan mukta, this is a very transcendent name for a soul that's liberated no matter what state of life they're living in, or what stage of life they're living in. They could be a worker, they could be a merchant, they could be a yogic householder, or just a householder. And if they're deeply in love with their ideal, with the Divine Lord and Mother of the Universe, and she or he sheds their grace upon him, on the devotee, and then all of a sudden they're a living liberated soul, and it doesn't matter what station of life they're living in or how they carry on thereafter. Freedom is freedom. So they've realized an end to ignorance and bondage, and that's where we're going today. Ajnana is the second thing which Sri Ram talks about, that is, complains bitterly about before his father and the queens and the priests, the Brahmin priests like Lord Vasishtha, and we gave mention last week, Lord Vishwamitra, these rishis that are there in the court. And they're all very surprised and stunned to hear this young soul talk in this way about the world, which for most young people is their oyster. They want to enjoy it. They want to move about it and experience everything they possibly can. But here is this young soul who has this stark discrimination, and this has been sobered by those things that are poison-like that most people don't take into account when they seek their pleasures. That is, that there is pain accompanying every pleasure. And it comes in cycles, so it's not always obvious that that's what's happening. So that's part of the false superimposition, what's being concealed in these otherwise very beautiful and desirous sets of objects that we find around ourselves, houses, and in this day and age, all the modern conveniences that weren't there when Ram was alive in the body. So these things are now being called to question, and it's therefore a very good teaching for us nowadays to take these ancient teachings of a very sobered soul who is an avatar still veiled, is about to come out and reveal even higher wisdom than something like Vivarta, and go far beyond something as distracting as suffering and ignorance. As if to say these things needn't be there and aren't there in the illumined souls. We hardly ever saw, for instance, Sri Ramakrishna suffer, and never saw him in ignorance. When he did suffer, he had learned how to take his mind beyond it. Oh, sir, I've touched you, and I've felt a shock of bliss come from you, one person said, when Sri Ramakrishna was suffering the cancer of his throat. And Sri Ramakrishna said, "Oh, you rascal, you've discovered my secret." So what secret is that? That his mind was always on the feet of his Ishtam, Mother Kali. And so the cancer in the throat, he could easily transcend that and not suffer from it. And do you suffer much from that, they asked him. Only when I come down to the body and talk to you, he told them. So this transcendence of the body and the senses is not only possible, it's probable in their case. They have mastered the senses, and they can use them still and forbear the pain that comes with that. but they would prefer to live in a state of non-dual awareness, in that Satchidananda, in that Mahakasha, that great space of consciousness that we were talking about just yesterday at satsang in the morning, and afterwards at the Brahman Bites session of God Blogs. So all of this is again warming us up after 6 days away from the main points of the series. So if you're looking on, you're probably seeing this chart, and we'll be using this as our main chart that takes us through this, what we're calling a month of Sundays, on this subject that started on Ramachandra's birthday, called Ram Navami, last Sunday, and now the second class is falling right on Easter, so we feel very comfortable in the divine atmosphere of these holy days. So you can see there that Vivarta, or false superimposition, covers the real with the unreal. He said it's blue in the sky, mirage in the desert. You could even say, like Sri Ramakrishna said, blue in the ocean when it's not really blue. It's making things appear other than what they are. And in the case of ocean and sky, that's not that pain-bearing. It's not so problematic. But in the cases of pleasures that people enjoy, or complacency that they put themselves in, prevarication, forgetting to keep on vigil and do their sadhanas, their meditations every day, and read the scriptures and have holy company, all of those things get covered by this attraction to mundane things, mundane preoccupations, and attachment to the objects that one then builds a samskara, or an impression in the mind about, which we see coming up here in this list. Samskaras are at the very bottom of it. So he starts off with this whole teaching about Vivarta, and we looked at this chart. We didn't finish it, so let's maybe put a capper on this chart and go to one other, because we said here that at the cosmic level, covering power is there at such principles as the cosmic mind, the Mahat. So this could be correlated to Mahat, to the Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, which is why I just started out chanting the Guru Stotram, Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Deva Maheshwara. So the Guru is really aligned with Lord Brahma and with Vishnu and with Shiva, and is the witness of all. So at that level, a very high level of consciousness, where these great beings are existing deep within the hearts of all beings, with words like antaryami or ishtam to contemplate, then you find out that this covering power is very thin, the veil is very thin. And the same would be true then with not only Mahat and Trinity, but Ishvara. So all three of those we've covered last week. Then you come down a step, or out a step would be better said, to the human mind, collective mind, the universe itself, and the ego self. So this ego self needs to be ripened, and it does its best form of that when it comes to the human form and begins to find out how to surrender its ego, to ripen its ego, by giving it to these higher principles like Ishvara. Oh, we thought that they offered the ego to Ishvara, and we thought that they committed themselves to the path and the Guru. Actually, we found out they just joined a club and quit it later on. See, so this is the way some people take to religious life or spiritual life. That deep commitment has to be there, and in order to have that commitment, you have to know what you're committing to. So these great principles described in the Jnana scriptures and in the Dharma, talked about in the Dharma, and contemplated by illumined souls and by adept students, are very important to bring into the thinking process of the mind. We need words for those. Chosen ideal is how we would say it in English if we talked about Ishvara, and if we talked about the Trinity, that's not unknown to us. There's a certain kind of Trinity present there in Christianity that we learned about. And the great mind, God's mind, is very, very subtle and not known to us that much. So we look deep inside to meditate upon this great mind, because we have a direct channel to it, because our minds are sparks off of that great fire. And our higher thoughts are thoughts that came from that space deep within us. As far as the mind at the collective level, manas, and the universe and the ego self, you can see those are all dewdrops there on this flower of Divine Mother's universe. That is her entire set of worlds in the greater universe. And you can see that living beings also are there, and tattvas, principles, prana that flows through everything. The 5 senses are then listed as smaller dewdrops. The 5 elements are there. And the subtle senses, called the tanmatras. This is a short list of the 24 cosmic principles, starting with Mahat all the way down to the 5 elements of air, earth, fire, water, and ether. There you see at the bottom, that one light shining, all shines. By its light, all is made manifest. All is made radiant. And so that's, of course, not Tatra Suryabhati chant from the Upanishads. And I don't know if we read this final quote on this chart, but seeing that one light shines through all these dewdrops, as Sri Ramakrishna said at the quote at the top of the chart, is how he explained how one light seems to divide itself into many beings, or in this case, many principles, from God's mind all the way down to the human mind, to living beings, to all those things in nature called elements and senses, and the human body, that there's one light shining there, and it seems to be divided. So this is a very good example of vivarta, or vivartopadana, how things look other than what they are. The gist of it all is all this is Brahman, which is the final Vedanta Dindima, the final conclusion of it all. But it's got this stamp on it, covering power over it, that's making it look like an object, or making it look like what appears to the senses, making it look like health and ill health in cases of prana, making it look like insentient principles that seem sentient, but they really aren't, because only consciousness is sentient. And you can just go right up the list using this measure of vivarta, sometimes called iti iti. Neti neti, you'd get to iti iti later. Neti neti, that, oh, I see that it's not that. The light is there, but it's not undivided. It's more light in this thing, less light in the last, more light as I go further in. That's what it means by one light shining, all else shines. By its light, all this is made radiant. So it's not the sun's light, in other words, that's making all this radiant. That's just one physical world. But the billion suns in the sky, where do they come from? And so you seek deeper for a light that is, on this rendering, undivided, not divided. And that's a measure you're going to have to use. So Rama is standing in front of everyone saying, there's this covering power over everything. I just became aware of it when I was on pilgrimage outside my father's castle walls. And I see, because that covering power is over everything, people are accepting everything that is external to be the only reality, and then they're suffering. So he already knows what the causes of suffering are. Buddha later was to say, noble truth number 1, there is suffering. Noble truth number 2, there's a cause for it, and so forth. So thousands of years prior to that, Ram, probably the same being, cut from the same avataric cloth as Lord Buddha, was standing in front of the people of that particular area and time in India and that age, and saying, this is why they're suffering, because they're not seeing through the covering power here. Vivarta, it's all been covered. So it's a very powerful point that he starts off with on this divine discourse, or discourse of divine discontent, we're calling it. So Sri Ramakrishna has something to add to that. He says, Brahman is qualified by the universe and its living beings. At the beginning, while following the method of not this, one has to eliminate the universe and its living beings. But as long as I consciousness remains, one cannot but feel that it is God himself who has become everything. he alone has become the 24 cosmic principles, listed here, some of them on this chart. So this I consciousness that persists in us, short of non-dual realization, called samadhi or nirvikalpa or nirvana, or Advaita, what Advaita Vedanta teaches, then this is the feeling, he says, that people have, that even though I see everything here, I'm not quite certain that all of this is Brahman, because the covering power is standing in front of it, and I haven't got the power yet to see through things, but I still feel like Brahman's there. So it's a very beautiful thing that Sri Ramakrishna says. It was one of his favorite positions. It's really called qualified non-dualism, or Vasishtha Advaita. And don't confuse that with the Lord Vasishtha. This is Vishishta. It's a state of philosophy. So it's qualified non-duality he's talking about there. And that's the best place to be when you try to explain what is beyond the appearance. At the same time, trying to explain, because of the appearance, there's what's this side of it called suffering and ignorance. So he goes to ignorance next. And there are ways of singing it too that I wanted to make sure and share with you. The Avatut, one of the great beings, likes to sing about this light, for instance, that we see here. Just one light shining. By its light all is lighted. Everything is made radiant by it. So Avatut would sing in that regard. Nirmula mula rahito hisado dito ham nirtuma duma rahito hisado dito ham nirdipa dipa rahito hisado dito ham Gyanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham Gyanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham. Translates into English. This is the very first verse that he sings in his Chalisa, we call it, out of the Avatutta Gita. He says, I am acreate, distinct from all worlds projected by the mind. I am ever present, never obscured by clouds of might covering, conjured by ignorance. I am the light shining in ether, objects, self-luminous. I am pure existence, economy and ecstasy, as boundless as the sky, infinite light, space. So a very beautiful verse he sings to end this chart when he says, I am the light shining in all other objects, but I am self-luminous. So that's Swayam Jyoti is the Sanskrit for that. So he's singing about this in the very first verse, trying to tell people that in their true self is like the sky, or like the ether. It's unbound. It can't be limited. It can't be sectioned off. Yet here it is, limited, sectioned off, conditioned, as Sri Ramakrishna has just said, by the very things that came out of it. So out of Brahman manifests all these worlds, yet they're not Brahman. Their foundation is Brahman. So then we have this matrix in between the two called the covering power, or the Shakti, and the prana that she has under her control. He's going to talk about that too. It'll be very interesting to hear what he says about that. So this is some finalization on something that we could talk about for actually hours and hours of class, this vivarta, this false superimposition. I think is when I came to Vedanta in my early 20s, it was the first thing I heard about. It's the first thing that stood out, that everything is covered, that the essential thing, that is covered by objects. And those objects have an origin. And then there is a exacerbated Maya that comes by thinking the objects to be real, that's going to cause ignorance of their true nature, ignorance of your true nature, and then the suffering that proceeds from that. So we're to think that Sri Rama has figured this out by the time he comes in front of the court of the king and tells everyone this great truth of transcendence, of seeing through, the power that the yogi has of seeing through appearances and then living in that state of transparency so that all they see is Brahman. And there are other verses I could sing you there that have to do with the way that he sees all as Brahman. There's another way we can look at Vivarta, and we do that. And this chart makes a good study of that. It's called the cutting through clouds of false superimposition, or the indispensable role of viveka in spiritual life. Last week we talked about viveka and vairagya, the discrimination between the real and the unreal, and the detachment that you have to apply in your spiritual life in order to step back from the unreal once you've seen it to be that. So you can see here the first quote is by Lord Vasishtha himself. So this is one of those things that he's transmitting to the young Ram. Because afterwards, after this divine discourse is given, that's when Vasishtha and Ram go off together, and Vasishtha starts teaching Ram about all of these aspects of Maya and suffering in people, and how to look at them in a more elevated and enlightened way. And that's what you'll find in this great book, because we're studying right now out of the Vairagya Prakarana of this great scripture. Vairagya, of course, means detachment or discernment. So if you were to read on after this discourse and its ramifications, then you would find out that student and disciple go off together and enter into a series, probably over days or weeks, of deep, in-depth teachings that use viveka to do away with vivarta, to attain vairagya, and to become a vivekananda, if you will, if you want to use a lot of V words. So Vasishtha says here, the appearance of the world, O Ram, is due to its being experienced through hundreds of births, devoid of yogic discrimination. The discriminating soul will pass beyond mere enjoyments, then, and secure these three great attainments: the knowledge of truth, the dissolution of the mind, and the effacement of desires. This is what Sri Ram would be sitting and hearing from Lord Vasishtha after he complained about all of these things, days later, when Vasishtha strikes up a plan of how to present the solutions to problems such as vivarta. We already looked here on the chart as it being the world manifests itself in Brahman. That's the solution for this problem of vivarta. So Vasishtha would be letting Sri Ram in on what the knowers of Brahman have found out for hundreds and thousands of years previous to that yuga. And all of a sudden, beings are becoming more illumined over time, over lifetimes, and they're not living in this way. Say that again. The appearance of the world, Ram, is due to its being experienced through hundreds of births, devoid of yogic discrimination. So then there are these souls that have been coming into birth. I just mentioned them, avatars, Jivan Muktas, and so forth, who have been coming to this world and seeing only Brahman, and with their yogic discrimination fully in hand, fully intact, like we saw with Swami Vivekananda in this day and age. So we have recent exemplars of that kind of discrimination in its most mature state, like Ramana Maharshi, Swami Vivekananda. I think Sri Ramakrishna was like beyond that, just living in samadhi all the time. He was a very unique being, as avatars are. Ram Krishna, you probably follow me there, what I'm saying. So in this way then, the seeing through clouds of false superimposition is talked about by Lord Vasishtha. Now he says three things are necessary, so he's giving him deeper teachings here. The knowledge of truth, the dissolution of the mind, and the effacement of desires. And those of you who have been studying in SRV for the 30 so years when it's been in existence here in America in the West, then have heard all of those things too. So knowledge of truth means study of the scriptures is a means to the knowledge of truth. So we have to hear the Shruti, we have to hear these great teachings like Upanishads and Gita and Brahma Sutras from the lips of illumined souls, like Ram is getting the opportunity to do with Lord Vasishtha, so that he'll really come into full realization of his indivisible, boundless consciousness, which is his essence. And avatars are the best exemplars of that, we know, and help other people. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is, and this is to cut through clouds of false superimposition, to keep us on point here, practice of yoga is the means to dissolution of mind. So study of scriptures will inform you of non-dual truth that the seers have realized. Then practice your yoga, and that will teach you how to dissolve the mind, like I was just saying, day to day, night by night, week by week, month by month, year by year, and lifetime by lifetime, so that you can depart this body, as these great souls have done, and as the Tibetan Buddhists have been telling us in their teachings on the Book of the Dead and so forth, with this dissolution of the mind already accomplished, because you're doing it every day, you see. So you're not giving the mind a chance to sprout seeds. You know what I mean? If seeds, Ramakrishna, if paddy, rice seeds are strewn, and then before the rainy season, and then the rains come and come back afterwards, there's all this riotous growth. And if those same seeds are burnt, then before they're strewn, then you'll come back after the rainy season and nothing there. So you want to keep the mind from developing and watering seeds of seed thoughts, which will, well, guess what? They'll turn into objects, and then they'll turn into situations with objects that breed attachment, and then that will then fall into suffering, you see, and then suffering leads to depression, and depression leads, just read about that in Sri Krishna's Gita. It's called the Road to Ruination, and it's got like 5 or 6 levels. Shankara would call it the problem of negligence of Brahman. The ball of the mind falls lower and lower down the stairs of negligence of Brahman. So all the seers are talking about this. What? About this lack of discrimination. Now, Sri Ramakrishna and Lord Vasishtha are many thousands of years apart, but I remember Sri Ramakrishna talking in the same vein, is that people experience life in the world because they've had many lifetimes thinking that the world is the only reality. Nobody ever came forward to them and told them, the world's not real, only Brahman is real. So it's a very subtle bit of truth, but it's very powerful, and if it's given at the right time through the lips of an illumined preceptor, as they say, as my teacher used to always say, then they wake up in this lifetime and they dream no more. From dreams awake, from bonds be free, know the truth. Thou art he, thou art she. In other words, thou art that very being that you're looking for. And by the way, that very being out of which all this riotous growth came. So the world manifests itself in Brahman due to Brahman's Maya. It's like poison in the snake. You stay away from that poison and don't get it injected into you, you'll be fine, even in Maya. But if it gets injected into you, then all of a sudden Brahman disappears behind the scene, and that's called Vyavarta. And the false superimposition power, called Avarana Shakti in a later age, covering power, becomes what you believe in, which basically would mean, we have words for it, and even in English, materialist, see, or sensualist, and so forth, hedonist, atheist, nihilist. When everything is full, 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 all of a sudden you've put everything that's unreal in front of that. It's as simple as a computer screen. Send to back, bring to front. Everyone knows those commands. So it would be nice if we had that ability over the computer of our minds, so to speak, to send all of that false appearance behind us and bring the reality forward with just a push of a button. So you might say then that that push of the button are these very solutions that Vasishtha is taking Ram aside later and saying, well, I hear what you said at the court of King Dasaratha, and here's how we deal with that as illumined rishis. It's come down through the tradition, and we've learned it from the lips of these great souls who are our gurus, and there are lines of gurus like that who are teaching this. This is called Guru Parampara, by the way, a line of succession of gurus, of teachings that come from guru to disciple. That disciple gives it to the next disciple, and so forth. So here's two solutions Vasishtha is giving Ram. This is the beauty of taking apart even a portion of a scripture like Yoga Vasishtha and fleshing it out, and we get a great opportunity to do that with Ram's discourse of divine discontent. So I hope you understand that this is then where we're going with mentioning after the fact, after he's given all this divine discourse, which we will take apart. Then he has his chance with Lord Vasishtha to realize all the solutions that this hoary old realized soul has been schooled in, because he was one of the 10 mind-born sons of Lord Brahma. Shall we go back and show the Mahat, the divine mind, God's mind? He got schooled by God's mind, Lord Vasishtha. He was one of the mind-born sons. So who better than him to take an avatar that has come out of the Vishnu part of the Trinity and tell him the solutions to everything he was complaining about. And divine remembrance, the Daiva Smriti we were talking about, comes to the mind, and Maya is gone, the covering power is gone. And I can't even remember what bondage was like. One day I woke up and my ignorance was gone, utterly gone. So otherwise, what is it like? It's experiencing bondage lifetime after lifetime until you come back to the world to do it again, because that's what your mind is conditioned to do. It's called transmigration. And it happens in 3 lower centers, if you look at the Kundalini system. So from these 3 lower centers, plants, animals, humanity, elementals, angels, celestials, ancestors, all live in those 3 centers. One of them is exterior, 2 of them are interior. And then there are ones that are transcendent beyond that, like the heart chakra, throat chakra, third eye chakra. These are things we hear about a lot, and then we go to a guru and study something like Kundalini Yoga with Sri Ramakrishna, who was the absolute master of that and had fully realized Mother Kali, or Mother Kundalini herself. So all of this to explain this very beautiful thing that Vasishtha is taking Ram aside after this has occurred. Here's the way we think about false superimposition. You need to know this. You can get rid of it by hearing the truth from us. You can get rid of it by dissolving your mind every day with your yogic practice, which Ram is probably already doing. You can also get rid of it, 3, by effacing your desires. Production of positive impressions is the means to effacing latent impressions. That's what we try and grasp at nowadays, to find an English translation for the Sanskrit word samskara, because if you were raised amongst the Brahmin priests like Sri Ramachandra was, then if they just said samskara to you, oh, now I know, I remember what, it's an impression in the mind. And back in the mind, these very impressions, if they're negative, are causing people to be reborn again. These very impressions, if they're positive, will help you escape rebirth. So you would always try and form positive impressions in your mind and do away with the negative impressions. And as late as, or put it this way, as recent as 140 BC, Father of Yoga was teaching this very thing, and he used the terms klista vritti and aklista vritti. Vritti is a vibration. So those vibrations in your mind again and again, lifetime after lifetime, are causing you to think that the world's real, that matter is real, that objects are real, that objects are the only things to be desired, because you have to efface those desires, to get free. And therefore, souls are stumbling and coming up against this elastic barrier. It's called Vishnu Granti, Brahma Granti, Vishnu Granti. Granti means a knot or a barrier, a dam. So coming up against this and falling back to earth, bouncing back and forth as if they hit something elastic and just gets pushed back down into the body and get pinioned there for 80 years of thinking this way, that matter is real, that objects will fulfill me, that there is no such thing as God, and so forth and so on. I think I have a chart to show you in a couple of weeks about manasana, only how negative manasana, how these negative thoughts cause people to formulate impressions called samskaras in the mind that then keep them bound into this kala chakra, this cycle of birth and death. So this is why this chart is a very good one to bring up in this regard. Basically, it's that if we want to cut through clouds of false superimposition, here's how we do it, young Ram. These three ways you have open to yourself, or all three. So out of Yoga Vasishtha, I extracted this. You could see that there are these three bubbles here. How about viveka at birth? If viveka is really the solution to false superimposition, then how does one use it? So when one comes back into birth, Vasishtha says, and remember he's telling Sri Ram this, so never lose sight of that fact. The primary disease of the mind is the desire for rebirth. The secondary disease of the mind is reincarnation devoid of discriminative wisdom. From its absence comes lack of control of the senses and the inability to quell desires. So viveka at birth would waylay all that, would dissolve all that. So this is why you want to practice discrimination and refine it to a T right here in this lifetime, and train yourself and your children and share this with people and with your parents if they don't know it in this age. That this is how to look at the world of appearances, that they are appearances and that you don't want to take them as reality. Take it all with a grain of salt. Learn how to see through it. Similarly, like the scientist has used electron microscope to see into the particle, atomic particle, to find that it's changing at a millionth of a second, well, you'd want to make a certain conclusion about that, like the Buddhists did. Well, this is empty. It's not going anywhere. And I see that it's arising and falling all the time and constantly. So there are other problems about Maya. Not only that it rises and it falls, but that it's veiling everything here. It doesn't just veil it, it distorts it. It doesn't just distorts it, but it can be used as a power to reveal the truth behind it. You become suspicious of what's behind the appearance of things, and then you might take time to go and look deeply what's the consistency of an object and get into layers of Maya like that. But Sri Ramakrishna said you should look everything through the microscope of the third eye and see beyond its appearance from a detached witness standpoint, not by getting involved into it, because then you're just fostering more of this, it's real, I'm studying it, and what I see, and even its changes are real, its transformation is real. But all of those are the very things in which, if you were a great soul like Lord Vasishtha, you'd be studying this from a witness standpoint and seeing that it all has cycles like Buddha saw, and you'd be withdrawing from it and renouncing it, giving it up. I see that it's not Brahman, I give it up. Sri Ramakrishna said in this day and age, everyone has to renounce the world, monk and householder. But the monk has to do it both internally and externally. The householder has to do it internally. Once sees the truth, then should say, I renounce this appearance of things. Now I need to go to the origin of it inside and see where it all started. This would also be true of your lifetimes. These many lifetimes he's talking about here. So remember, the primary disease of the mind, according to Vasishtha, is the desire to be reborn. That's the first disease. That's Sara, they call it, essential disease. Samanya would come later. It would mean secondary disease is that you've come here into this body-mind mechanism without your discrimination. You left it at home. You shouldn't leave home without that. Viveka is what you take everywhere with you in order to keep yourself safe from problems like false superimposition. And you can just well imagine that hearing Ram speak about this in front of everyone, many of the people in the court who are listening to his discourse of divine discontent are saying, my God, that's really true, and it's surprising, it's sobering. I have to go ruminate on this. I have to go contemplate on it. That's called manana in that age. So they spent a lot of time manana. Once they heard the truth, shravana, then they went and spent time manana, thinking about it. This was real quality time. There's no better quality time. This is better quality time than time you'd spend with your family or children. You must do your manana first. Clear it up in your own mind, and then spend quality time with your children, speaking to them about this strange apparition that they see dancing in front of them called the world, which will never satisfy them, and which will most probably not only cause them to suffer, but will bring them back again here to do more of the same in the future. I was just smiling because Sri Ramakrishna said the world was like a hog plum. A hog plum is a fruit in India, and if you eat it, you have to peel off the skin, take out the pit. And by the time you get done preparing the hog plum, it's just a little tiny bit of flesh, hardly worth the effort. And then you eat it, and it gives you indigestion. So if this is the avatar of this age, Sri Ramakrishna, the avatar of the Kali Yuga, if this is what he says about the world, that he compares it to a hog plum, then probably he's giving us a discourse of divine discontent called The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And we should probably look into that book and read it and take his teaching seriously and master this art of viveka. Because the greatest soul born on earth recently, the avatar's greatest monastic disciple, because we have to be careful about that, because Sri Sharada was his best and first disciple. But the avataric descent has this divine messenger with him. He named himself after Viveka. So Vivekananda, he thought it was that important that people, particularly in the West when he came here, mastered this art of detachment from what was not real. It's just so key to the Vedanta philosophy. How could you go very deep into Vedanta philosophy if you didn't understand this main precept, one of its main precepts? So you can see they have done their manana on it, and they said it happens at birth, this covering power. For most people, So you have to look at rebirth as a kind of disease. It's a very strange position to be caught in because most people don't believe in rebirth. So how are you going to convince them about discrimination, about rebirth, if they don't even believe in rebirth? Amongst those who do believe in rebirth, then they're thinking maybe, I have as many lifetimes as I want to enjoy this. But satiation never comes in it, and suffering always attends it. What about those instructions that the seers give us? Well, maybe enough about viveka at birth. Let's look at viveka of bhakti. We need to, as Shankara did so well, make sure that we bring this discrimination into the bhakti yoga path. The failure to implement viveka into the path of bhakti leads to worship of the ego rather than authentic love of God. The outcome is preoccupation with surface practices like asana and affectatious singing and dancing. So we see today, in particular in today's day and age, and in America and Europe, that viveka hasn't become something very popular, but the worship of the ego, the self, has become very, very important. We dress it well, we feed it well, we set it up as being the king of the throne. It's the darling of the mind. It's the darling of everyone else around us, and we want to make sure it's trimmed well, the hair looks good, it's clean, and so forth. And this is all body worship. You should hear what Vivekananda says about that in some of his letters after he arrived here in America and sent them back to his brother monks and to Bellarmont. Talking about, boy, they've come up with such a frippery society here. I quote him directly in English. What a frippery society they've created here. You should see how many instruments they have for toilet and for paring the nails, for cutting the hair, for painting themselves up, and so forth. So all of this was present also then in the surface bhakti that worships the ego, is the point. Who loves God? Sri Ramakrishna said. Who really loves the Lord, and how does a lover of God look, act? It's been asked by great bhaktas like Uddhava or Arjuna or Narada. How does a great lover of God act? How do they think? How do they move? How do they eat? They keep holy company. They eat pure, sattvic, blessed food. You can go on down the list and see how a lover of God is living in that love of bhakti, true bhakti. It's unconditional love. If it's conditional love, then it's got all of these problems of false superimposition over it. And so you need to bring viveka into bhakti in this day and age and make sure that it's the real thing. That's one of the three places that we can go with this teaching that is talked about by the great souls. How about viveka and meditation? Because that's another path right now that's fairly popular amongst those few who are leading a spiritual life. But there are problems in it, we see, because, as my teacher used to say, where are the Jivan Muktas? Why hasn't the West produced a living liberated soul when there's so many have been produced in India and more being produced in Tibet and so forth? So the quote here from Shankara is, "Sure knowledge of Brahman is gained by meditation upon correct teachings given by the illumined Guru, never through sacred ablutions, almsgiving, or hundreds of breathing exercises." So taking us beyond the lower limbs of yoga into the angas of Vedanta, which we've studied before in the Amrita Bindu Upanishad and in other Upanishads. The sure knowledge of Brahman is gained by meditation upon correct teachings. And Sri Krishna says about meditation, that one attains to perfection who, restraining the mind and the senses via discrimination, directs all his organs along the path of dharmic works. So here's how you might say all four yogas are worked into this the karma yoga mentioned there at the end. There has to be discrimination coming from practice of Jnana Yoga. What was it up there? We called it study of scriptures, working itself into the 8-limb yoga, which was yoga of dissolution of the mind, and coming right on down to the power of being able to destroy samskaras, like, say, of action and of work. What Shankara mentions here as being hundreds of breathing exercises and asanas and various things like that. This sort of discrimination will come and cut through all of this if we can develop the arms strong enough to lift it. And that's, of course, called qualifying yourself for the teachings of Vedanta and other great darshanas like Buddhism. Lord Vasishtha also appears in this great non-dual scripture called Jivan Mukti Viveka. Here's one quote I found of his there. The sterling virtue of discriminative restraint relies upon higher knowledge, and that noble wisdom depends upon the self-same virtue, even as the lake and the lotus thrive upon one another. Through such rare and incomparable practice are the fetters of the heart severed, just like the threads running through a lotus when its stalk is cut. So, Jivan Mukti Viveka, very powerful scripture, usually read and practiced only by the monastic side of humanity. Basically has great metaphors in it like that, like the lake and the lotus thriving upon one another, this higher wisdom and discrimination depend upon each other. And this is why this chart is perfect for helping to show how Ramachandra is being trained by Vasishtha even after he gave his great discourse here. Let's move on then to the next entry, which is Ajnana. I just chanted Ajnana Timirandasya Jnana Jana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitan Yena. Chakshur, you've opened the inner eye of wisdom and by cutting through the ignorance of karmas and lifetimes. Like here it said, Viveka at birth. By cutting through, you've allowed that person to become free. And Vivekananda said, I want all to be free as the air they breathe. So this is why the Avatar's messenger wants to give this out to everyone and let them hear the truth first, and then work on it and realize it over time. You don't just hear it and don't do your manana and your nididhyasana. That's just shravana when you hear it. But you have to take it into practice, contemplate it, and then realize it. And that's also called shruti, yukti, and anubhava. So you get this wonderful fulfillment of these three great proofs of truth, sometimes they're called, when you take it the full distance. So next on this chart, we refer always back to it in this series of classes, Ajnana, root ignorance. So basically, Ram says it's a source of all misery and suffering. That is, in one tradition you might say sin is, but the only sin really, or sin is equivalent in Vedanta and to Hindu way of teaching, to just ignorance of your true nature. If you knew your true nature, sin wouldn't even be in the picture. You'd just be virtuous. And virtue itself, as we just found out, already quoted in the last chart, will do away with all those false superimpositions, because ignorance is one of those. It's not actually real. And you remember Sri Ramakrishna talking about darkness in a cave going away when you bring in a torch, and the darkness has been there for 1,000 years. So if you equate that darkness to root ignorance in the human mind, the cave's the human mind, you bring this knowledge in and discrimination, and you light that torch up in the human mind, the darkness of ignorance goes away right away. Oh great, we love that. But what's the real point? It wasn't real in the first place. It didn't have any substance. Now, if you could realize that before you even started your path, which is why you get the non-dual truth told you first, then your path is going to be much smoother, the realization of the ideal, and it's going to be much swifter. And this is one of the ways in which to guide even beginning souls. You tell them, here's the truth of the matter, as Ramakrishna told Vivekananda. Now put this in your wearing cloth and ruminate on it. Go anywhere, take it out, and teach people with it. But take it into yogic method, is what this last chart told us. Practice dissolution of the mind with it. In the same way that you might say, I'm not the body, later on you're going to want to try this with the mind. I'm not the subtle body either. The subtle body is full of all sorts of errors. It's filled with dualities. In fact, everything problematic came from the mind. That's its origin, mind, manas. With its ego compartment, with its intellect compartment, and with its thoughts, which are klista and aklista, pain-bearing and pleasure-bearing, constantly knocking up against one another like that. This is the mind. If you got up deeper into the cosmic mind, you'd see all of these things leveled out. You'd see them all neutralized, and you'd see a very sattvic condition, a pure sattvic condition that doesn't even know what ignorance is about. That was a false superimposition, wasn't it? And things that are false, even though they appear as real, I've learned that they're not real, so I saw through that. And then I became a realized soul. I became a Jivan Mukta. And my ignorance was gone, utterly gone, and never came back, because it was never there in the first place. So you have these Advaitic fallback positions. And this is what Lord Vasishtha is describing to Sri Ram, trying to get him to understand the depths of this, because he's brought everyone into the picture here now. Everyone's wondering why they're having such a nice time in King Dasaratha's court, and why they're hearing the teachings every night, but they haven't turned into realized souls yet. It's a problem with the spiritual path, that you rest on your laurels. You think what you've heard has saved you, but you haven't yet done manana or had nidijasana yet. That direct spiritual realization has to come to you, and it'll only come by thinking about Brahman all the time, by thinking about the teachings constantly, by running them over and over in your mind. Just like running good food through the body turns it healthy, these Dharma teachings constantly entertaining the mind will purify the mind and make it sattvic. So, a little diatribe of my own about ajnana, how we can't start out thinking, oh, this is real, when we've just talked about false superimposition, can we? So what does Ram say about it? My note here says, page 12, in this prakarana. So he says to the court, as I gaze out upon the world, I see beyond all the subtle obscurations, clever imputations, and deceitful pretenses, and hypocrisy, to a state that transcends all these futile rounds of birth and death that all beings are so adamantly engaged in, enamored of, and enmeshed in. All the many objects and sense enjoyments possible in this world, all possessions and all relationships, all of various occupations, and the host of sensations that they bring to us, when I systematically began to analyze them at true face value, I found that I had lost all love for them. The water of false promise, appearing in the mirage of delusion, that hangs suspended above the desert of this transitory world, now being known by me for what it really is, all unreal, has ceased to attract me anymore. Yet, he goes on, my own delusion around this matter still clings to the mind, despite such conclusions, like a cherry pit stuck in the throat, posing immediate danger. Where is peace, that peace that is supposed to descend upon the advent of such mature dispassion? So he's in that unique state, exemplifying for us what it's like to suffer, like with cholera. Ramakrishna said, all the way up to the end. See, and in that disease, evidently, you suffer all the way to your time that you draw your last breath. You don't get any respite from that suffering. So that's the predicament, he says, of a person who has found out that the world's real, unreal, but cannot give it up. It's like a problem that's stuck like a cherry pit in the throat. Is that, I think, what he says here? Yeah, it's like a stone stuck in one's throat is the analogy and metaphor next to the ajnana. And what's the solution? An illumined teacher in holy company. And I would say maintained for your whole life, or maybe for lifetimes. This taking a guru and giving him up, this getting a little bit into a path and then walking away, this taking of a mantra or many mantras and then not utilizing them with any wisdom, this reading of the Gita once and then never studying it with a teacher, all of these things we see running rampant in today's day and age. That's not real Dharma, and it's not what the Gyanis who teach this Jnana wisdom want us to do with this once it's given to us. It's got to have its full effect. And in that way, now that we've taken up a Jnana and looked at the complaint, looked at the analogy, and told the solution already, because it's a good thing to do out front so that we know what we're talking about, then let's look at this chart about the disappearance of ignorance. Also, I think has quotes by Lord Vasishtha on it and other great souls. So you can see in this chart, ignorance and avidya is like the base of the trikona, right at the bottom there. This is where the soul starts. And I wanted to look soon at the 6 or 7 lower states of knowledge called ignorance after we see this chart to show you how a soul can come up through states of ajnana and reach 7 higher states of jnanam. That's what we hope to accomplish today in our time. So here we have the foundation and 2 paths which are told by the luminaries to the seekers of freedom, which will have to be seekers of transcending suffering, won't it? We know that already. On the left-hand side, you see a path that is rather like a more bhakti influence. Starts with some excitement, as we see in youthful people, oh, this is a great path, this new Vedanta Swamiji has brought into us. I should learn about it. So otherwise, as Sharda Devi says there, the happiness of the world is transitory. The less you become attached to the world, the more you can enjoy peace of mind. So she's already starting us off towards getting beyond sukha, happiness, and getting what's called mudita, or joy. Prema mudita manusikaho, Rama Rama Ram, Sri Rama Rama Ram. I'm thinking of a beautiful bhajantaram that has that word mudita in it. So it's not just your everyday joy, but it's based on this anticipation and excitement that brought you some real happiness based in knowing this all to be a false superposition, and that there is a great soul behind it, a great consciousness behind it, even if you haven't realized it yet. So this is also something that needs to be mentioned so that we don't either fall away from pursuing this path after a short time, as I was just mentioning, or just jump to the chase and just kind of dance and sing and try and dance and sing the problems of the world away. And good luck with that. But you can see how it has to go its full distance. So Sri Ramakrishna says, the happiness of the worldly man slowly declines as his spiritual joy becomes deeper. So this is in that level of true joy and true happiness. Those are signs along the way. If it's just a temporary happiness, as Holy Mother talked about in that first quote, then something suspect. And you probably want to use your discrimination, what's that called again, viveka, to look at the false superposition of mixed happiness, sukha dukkha it's called, to get to this real joy, mudita. Go further than that and you see that the real earmark here of attainment would be jnanam, wisdom. So that's very much a part of the bhakti path, as Shankara would tell, as we were just talking about discrimination in bhakti being so important. Because Vivekananda said you must have that jnanam in the bhakti path, because otherwise bhakti can become sentimental and emotional. So wisdom will check that. The quote there by Holy Mother is, perhaps one practices japa and austerity in this life. In the next life, one intensifies the spiritual mood, and in the following advances it further, and thus spiritual evolution goes on. So she gives credence and merit to this kramamukti, or slow path of lifetime by lifetime, honing your discrimination and increasing your wisdom until ignorance is just gone, utterly gone. When that happens, then they have what's called tripti, a real contentment comes over you. Vivekananda says, we believe that every being is divine, is God. Every soul is a sun covered over with clouds of ignorance. The difference between soul and soul is only due to the difference in density of these layers of clouds. Very nice quote when we just looked at this previous chart, which is about cutting through clouds of ignorance. So it's not just that, what, you say you're God? Blasphemy. No, actually I didn't say it. I said that all beings are God. This is all God. So we believe that every being is divine, is God. However, some of them still have a few clouds of ignorance floating there. And some have transcended and gone beyond. Beyond the world is, of course, to get up above the clouds, isn't it? So if they've really done their complete renunciation of the world as being unreal, then the open sky of awareness, the open space beyond all religion, is what our founder, Lex Sixon, used to call that, opens up to them. And there's the death of ignorance. There's the end of rebirth in ignorance. And there's the end of assuming ignorance to even be real in the first place. Beyond that kind of divine contentment is peace, shanti. Beyond that, equanimity, samatva. Maybe you won't want to read what Vasishtha has to say about samatva, because it might take your idea of what nirvikalpa is and really expand it. I mean, this is like a peace that passes all understanding, kind of samatva. And then bliss, ananda, that beautiful word in Sanskrit. Sri Ramakrishna says, if a man but tastes the bliss of God, he runs after it thereafter. It matters little to him then whether the world remains or disappears. At the end of that trikona trajectory is fulfillment. Then you can take the discipline path. This smacks a little bit more of the jnanam path per se. So you've kind of got jnana and bhakti here side by side, and ways in which beings rise out of the ignorance using these various tools of the seers and of the darshanas of India. So on the other side then, there's dharma. Beings rush to it. And it's a goddess, actually. There's quotes about dharma being the greatest goddess, because she will free you from all ignorance and rescue from suffering. Milarepa says, whenever I contemplate the teachings of the Dharma, I cannot help but share them with others. So he's got the right spirit. Spread this around, especially to children and family. Holy company then comes next on that inward path. Satsanga. And here's Vasishtha's quote. The non-dual scriptures point the way to moksha, that most elevated condition that is the very atmosphere of divine reality. It's fostered by svadhyaya, scriptural study, as we've already looked at in several cases. And manana. So here's where you find out study of scripture fueled by reflection on it, which I've been accenting so much, is extremely important I'd say it's probably one of the next hurdles we need to have more en masse here in America and Europe and the West, that we can't just read the Gita once and then maybe hear a little discourse about it from someone. We really have to enter into it and make these scriptures our very own. We have to memorize slokas out of them. I can think of the Gita right now and a handful of scriptures come to my memory. Slokas, I mean, out of that scripture. And then when they're in your mind, you can think about them. Oh, that's so beautiful, And they're a part of you. It's like food, nutrients of food become a part of your muscles and sinews and your blood. Just like that, when you put your mental body, your mind, upon memorizing these things, they become a part of your thoughts. And these are thoughts that will last you through a lifetime and into the next lifetime. This lack of klistavrittis and this burgeoning of aklistavrittis, and then finally these very positive thoughts, all have to do with retentive memory. And then, when they know the truth, they like to go and do tapas. They like to have some austerity in the picture. Sri Sharada Devi says about that, perhaps one practices japa, that's recitation of the mantra, and austerity, tapas, in this life. In the next lifetime, one intensifies the spiritual mood. In the following, advances it further, and then spiritual evolution goes on. I read that earlier. That's also in terms pertinent to austerity. Then the self-effort and sadhana kicks in. So you can see this is really a path of exertion, we call that self-discipline. Sadhana is the word, and it's also one of the things you find missing in spiritual life of many people nowadays, to do this constant practice every day, and it's already been well outlined. And then attainment becomes sampadhyate, and transcendence, para, is reached. That's the path of discipline as outlined by this chart, starting with dharma and ending in transcendence. The other one started with enthusiasm, you might say, and ended in bliss. So these are very beautiful ways of the soul rising out of ignorance. Swami Vivekananda says, the secret of religion lies not in theories, but in practice. This is all I have to preach. Doctrines have been expounded enough. There are books by the millions. Oh, for an ounce of practice. And to finish this chart then, with these two quotes. At the time of creation, people had wisdom from their very birth. Now we're talking about that yuga in which Sri Ram was born. Consequently, they at once realized the unreal nature of the world. They renounced it, practiced austerity. They were liberated in no time. So the Divine Mother of the Universe in the form of Sri Sharada Devi in this age gives us that jewel, that. And at the bottom, to finish up this chart, Lord Vasishtha says, from peace a fuller, richer, noble knowledge will dawn, to be tempered further still by the apt instructions proceeding from an illumined preceptor, in conjunction with the revealed scriptures. Then, through sententious striving, you shall come upon, in a state of spiritual exaltation, that truth which you are seeking, and which puts to death even the most delicate, diaphanous tendrils of ignorance. That's out of the scripture then, Yoga Vasishtha. We're drawing those great quotes. And this is what the Lord Vasishtha is telling to Ram, again, after he has given this discourse of divine discontent to that whole court of the king there, of the Kosala kingdom, King Dasaratha's kingdom, right inside the palace walls after his pilgrimage. So it's a very beautiful setup, continues to grow in immensity and import as we dig deeper and deeper into this. So as the time runs out on us, let's take quickly, because it won't take that long, the bottom part of this chart on stages. In this way, it would be called Ajnana Bhumika. So we're talking about Ajnana. He's called it the source of all misery and suffering, as if you didn't have this root ignorance in you, then you would already be enjoying the bliss of Brahman. You would already be having transcendence of the world, and you'd be living in the state of a Jivan Mukta, a living liberated soul. Otherwise, there's that stone stuck in your throat, that cherry pit that pretends danger. So in the remaining minutes, we will finish off this Ajnana and look at these lower 7. So say the soul starts off in a state of root ignorance. You see the bubble at the very bottom left. As the next state proceeds, awareness of the individual and inception of its difference from everything kicks in. And these are both called ignorance inside of the world, Jagrat, being born in the waking state. They're aware of these things, or unaware of it, as the case may be, but these are things that are keeping them bound into this root ignorance. Then, as Sri Ramakrishna said in that beautiful quote, a man eventually becomes aware of things other than himself. Remember that last week? And begins to spread out. So at that part, the progression of repeated rebirths occurs as a possibility to the mind. How many of us can remember that? Maybe I've been here before. Maybe this is all very familiar, and I've heard about the rebirth teaching in some religions. I should consider that. But at that time, the soul is still thinking of man and universe being dissimilar. In other words, hasn't made the connection that all of this has come from this. What is out there really comes from inside the heart, which means here the great mind. So everything external has come from the internal, and both of them are infinite, as the Upanishads say. You march up one step to Jagat Swapna, then sovereignty over nature, as you can see, has happened to mankind in this particular time. But because of that, gets attached to the objects that he's receiving from nature and continues to labor under delusion. So this is a kind of a dream with bad side effects, you might say. This is the fourth state of Ajnana. So we're seeing some progress made, if you will. Maybe becomes more apparent at the state of Swapna, or fifth state, when a man or somebody, a human being who's practicing, gains some objectivity, examines life events in dream, and remembers upon awakening. This is a soul that's beginning to make some connection between the first two states of consciousness. Let's call them A and U, because the M will round it all off. Om, everything comes from the word. In the beginning was the word. So the waking state is the A, and the dreaming state is the U. So he's actually beginning to examine all of this potential that exists in thoughts, in dreams, and begins to think about them when he or she awakens. Beyond that, recalls events long past. This is when things from past lifetimes start recurring. And in this way, the waking state begins to become lucid. Realizes that they need to do some practice here in the waking state to bring the mind aware, to bring consciousness into the picture, if you say. Then Sushupti is called deep sleep, and at that state, the seventh state of Ajnana, realizes all states are beset with pain. Now, this is kind of where we started out with this discourse of divine discontent. Everything he's saying here is talking about the presence of suffering, or pain, if you will. And so some souls are born in that higher state of having a clear mind, being ready to a certain degree for having to face off with suffering that's coming to them over lifetimes. Another way of putting this is, perceives that all worlds are in Maya. And you can see there, those 7 Ajnana Bhumikas Abhumika really means a kind of sunken land or a sunken ground or a sunken level of ignorance that we're talking about here. And so these are what I wanted to point out to end our class so that we can get through this second point of discourse that Ram's giving about ajnana, root ignorance. Maybe we'll start off next Sunday mentioning a few more things about this. We could read a few quotes, but you could see that it's a good place to end because it really is, this suffering is becoming the obvious problem that Ram is facing. Because he said, even in my own mind, I see this, I don't really see a solution for this for everyone. Maybe he can see a solution for himself. He can meditate upon internal peace that he's been doing since he got back from the pilgrimage. So, but he can't really explain how he can remove the suffering from people outside the castle, and even from people who are acting in ignorance inside of the castle, because he also told us about that, these pretenses that are going on in the castle itself. So this is the beloved Sri Ram that we like to sing about, look back thousands of years. His teachings are still right here amongst us, and we sing to him, Sri Ramachandra Kripalu Bhajamana Harana Bhava Bhayadaranam Sri Ram, Sri Ram, Sri Ram Nava Kanchalochana Kancha Mukakara Kancha Kantanjarunam. Sri Ram, Sri Ram, Sri Ram, Jai Sri Ram. May peace come unto all, then. May higher wisdom dawn upon all. May all see the face of truth, be fortified by the armor of love. Om Bhadram Karnebihi Sriniyama Devaha Bhadram Pasyema Akshabir Yadatraha Stirairangaish Tushtuvam Sastanavir Vashema Devahitam Yadayahu. May we see with these eyes what is good and spiritual, hear with these ears what is noble and uplifting, and may we, while worshiping the Lord and Mother with healthy minds and bodies, live a life which is beneficial to ourselves and to all other beings. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat Om.